This following question was anonymously sent in, and I'm going to provide a biblical answer. So the question is, can we shoot, quote, real Muslims? Wow. There are a few things going through my mind in response to this. First, we need to get to the bottom of what is intended by this question. I'm not sure what was meant by real Muslim. It could mean one of a few things. I wouldn't word it the way it was worded. I assume what was meant was, may Christians kill extremist Muslims, or may we use lethal force against violent extremists? And I'll address that in a moment. But for now, I'll say the question shouldn't really be, can we shoot anyone? It comes off as if you're eager to kill people and looking for an excuse to do it. However, I realize that may not be how the question was intended. So, more correctly, it should really be asked, should we kill extremist Muslims? And that's possibly how it was actually intended. If they meant ordinary, non-violent Muslims, by that definition, a Muslim who genuinely interprets the Quran in a non-extremist way, then no, definitely not. Not all Muslims are extremists. Many live peacefully, even though they don't believe the truth about Jesus. Groups like ISIS or the Taliban follow a literal extremist interpretation which can be violent. But many Muslims don't practice their religion that way. Apparently, the majority of Muslims worldwide reject this literalist or extremist approach and practice their faith peacefully. Christians must never kill other people because of their religion. Violence motivated by hatred or prejudice is incompatible with the gospel. When someone is actively committing violence, Christians may have to use lawful and proportionate force to protect life, which I'll explain in a moment. But that is very different from executing or targeting people for their beliefs. Homicidal violence motivated by hatred is never Christian. Now, if they do hold to an extremist interpretation, but they're not harming anyone or putting it into practice, then that still isn't grounds for shooting them. However, it is grounds for perhaps notifying law enforcement. If you're aware of anyone who holds to extremist beliefs, it is good and wise to report credible threats to or extremist ideologies that could lead to violence. You don't need proof of action. Reasonable suspicion is enough for them to assess and investigate. And that's true regardless of whether they're a Muslim or a professing Christian or whatever. People who have done mass shootings usually held extreme views leading up to it. And if the police had been made aware, they could have done something to stop it and save people. Biblically, we're not to take the law into our own hands. If we witness crime being committed or know a specific plot is in progress, we are required to report it. Extremist beliefs alone are not a license for violence. Holding extremist ideas, even abhorrent ones, isn't in itself grounds for killing someone. It may be grounds to inform authorities or seek intervention, pastoral care, or de-radicalization efforts, but not private execution. If an extremist is in the process of practicing their ideology, your priority should be to call emergency services immediately and get people out of there. Don't try to fight them, because you could put your own life at risk or endanger others. First choice should be to run and only use self-defense as a last resort. If other people can't get out of there and the police are not going to be there in time, or you can't get out of there and you choosing to wait for the police means you or someone else will die or be seriously harmed, then I think you have a biblical and legal grounds to use reasonable force to stop that person. However, you need to be sure of this, because if you don't actually need to use force, or you don't really believe you or others are in danger, even though you may be trying to stop a threat, you are risking getting yourself in legal problems. In court, you would need to show there was an immediate threat of death or serious injury. Your response was proportional to the threat. Using force was necessary because no safe alternatives existed. Your intention was to protect, not punish or harm, and your belief in the danger was reasonable under the circumstances. Beyond that, I guess your question would delve into a situation where extremist Islam overtakes your country and an extremist group like the Taliban or ISIS become the government, and they start enforcing extreme militant form of Sharia law and doing radical stuff like throwing gay people off rooftops, stoning adulterers, enslaving and raping women, indoctrinating boys for suicide missions, banning women from education, suppressing free speech, etc. In that case, I don't think you should be taking up arms in the name of Christianity, because his kingdom, Jesus' kingdom, is not of this world, and we don't enforce Christianity with physical force. The Bible is very clear that Christians are not called to go out and kill people from other religions, even extremist Muslims. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight." That means Christianity doesn't spread by violence or by the sword, but by preaching the gospel. Paul also wrote, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." This is in the context of taking personal revenge. It is forbidding personal vengeance and vigilante justice. However, in the following chapter, Paul says that the government is God's servant to execute vengeance, and he even says they do not bear the sword in vain. The sword is not for slapping people. It is for giving murderers the death penalty and for fighting in a just war to restrain and drive back evil. When God first instituted the death penalty for murderers, it was not in the law of Moses. It was part of the covenant he made with Noah, which hasn't been cancelled. When the Roman soldiers came to John the Baptist asking what they needed to do to repent, he didn't tell them to get out of the Roman army. Fighting in the military as a member of society against evil people is not sin. Christians should report credible threats of violence to the authorities and work through lawful channels. We aren't to act as judge, jury, and executioner. When violence is occurring, we are to protect life, call the authorities, use reasonable force only as a last resort. The church and state should be separate. However, as a member of society fighting against evil who happens to be a Christian, you are not wrong to join the army and kill in that context, as long as you're doing it with the right intentions to drive back evil, not out of bloodlust. Christians can serve in the military and in law enforcement. God has given governments the sword to punish evil and protect the innocent. If a Christian is a soldier or a police officer, they may need to use force, even deadly force, to stop people committing violence. But as a private citizen, we are not told to take justice into our own hands. So if a government becomes tyrannical and commits gross injustice, resistance issues become complex. Historically, Christians have debated resistance. If a government perpetrates genocide or severe tyranny, Christians might join lawful resistance to defend the innocent. But motive, proportionality, and separation of church and state must be carefully considered. This is not an excuse for bloodlust or religiously motivated killing. So in that instance, I don't think it would be wrong to join a militia or a resistance or a rebel group, but it has to be standing up to a particularly evil and tyrannical government. For example, I don't think Germans in Nazi Germany were wrong to join an underground resistance and fight back in that context. I think they were doing the right thing. A friend of mine was once in disagreement with my views on Christians fighting in war. He thought this on the basis that Christians are to love their enemies and turn the other cheek, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. I said to him, what about fighting the Nazis in World War II? They killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. The only way the Nazis were going to be stopped was with lethal force. And how would refusal to use lethal force be loving to the Jews who were being slaughtered? How is that loving your neighbor, the oppressed Jew? So he changed his mind very quickly when he heard that. When Jesus spoke about turning the other cheek, he was addressing personal insults and offenses, emphasizing the heart motivation of the believer, trusting God for justice and showing grace to others rather than seeking revenge. The principle is about how we respond to personal wrongs, not about ignoring real danger. Scripture makes a clear distinction between retaliation and self-protection. Seeking revenge and protecting innocent life or neutralizing threats are not the same. Turning the other cheek does not mean leaving yourself or others defenseless. After all, you only have one other cheek. Legitimate self-defense is supported in Scripture, showing that it is appropriate to protect life while maintaining a heart of love and restraint. Beyond that, it gets into the issue of, are radical or extremist Muslims a tiny minority? There are many people out there who hold the belief that most or even all Muslims in Western society are secretly extremist in their beliefs and lying to Westerners because they're employing a version of the Muslim doctrine of taqiyya more broadly to justify deception in advancing Islamic goals. The idea is that they are waiting until they outnumber people in Western society, and when they do, they will take over and enforce an extreme version of Sharia law, which will come in and extremist Islam will rule in the West.
What is the draw of Islam to the West? Why is the West kind of floating over to it?
Yeah.
What is the appeal?
Are Muslims allowed to lie for the sake of spreading Islam? They're coming here and they're saying, yeah, we love you guys, we back you guys, but the moment they are the majority, they will turn and Sharia law will take over. And if Sharia law takes over, women will be beaten. If Sharia law takes over, homosexuals will be chucked off buildings. If Sharia law takes over, pastors will be killed, women will be raped, children will be turned into Muslims, and churches will be bought and turned into mosques, which is what's happening in London. So I think what they're doing now in America is they're practicing taqiyya, where they're lying to your face until you let them in. And once you let them in, they'll take over.
I would be curious to hear what people think of this. So please share your thoughts in the comments of this video. For me, to be sure about something like that would require careful, reliable study, and even then, firm conclusions might be hard to draw. So right now, I can't prove that this is true, and the mainstream belief seems to go against this. So I don't know enough to be able to confirm this, and I'm very skeptical of this. But let's consider if that is the case. If all the Muslims around us were secretly extremists and part of a long-term Islamic conspiracy scheme to infiltrate Western society and overpower us, can we use lethal force against them? Actually, no. You can't use lethal force against someone based on what you suspect they believe or might do in the future. Both legally and biblically, that would be considered premeditated killing, which is a crime, it's murder, and morally wrong. You cannot harm or accuse someone because of what you think they might do, where you don't have proof. And if you do have proof, then you should be reporting it to the authorities. If you were reporting proof to the authorities and authorities refuse to act, then that complicates things. So let's frame the hypothetical situation. You find out that a group in society were secretly extremists and plotting with a long-term plan to take over society and the government and enforce evil laws. But the authorities won't acknowledge or act on the evidence of this because they are somehow blinded by political correctness and false empathy. Also, you know that if you wait for these extremists to carry out their plot, which will be in the future when they outnumber everyone else in society, it will then be too late to fight back and stop them. So what do you do from a moral perspective? I think the best way to approach this is to break it into a two-phase approach. Phase one is how to respond in the early stages of plotting before the extremist group fully reveal their intentions and take power. Phase two is how to respond when the extremist group take power and begin enforcing evil laws. So beginning in phase one, the threat is potential, not fully realized. Morally responsible action in this phase is non-violent resistance and exposure. Document and preserve evidence. Alert independent oversight bodies, journalists, or advocacy groups. Protect vulnerable individuals or groups who could be targeted, and this can involve hiding or shielding those at risk, although in some ways this is more applicable in phase two. It should be noted here that lying is usually wrong, but there are rare cases in the Bible where it was the right thing to do to protect innocent lives. For example, in the book of Exodus, the ruler of Egypt, the Pharaoh, commanded that all the Hebrew baby boys should be killed at birth, but the women who worked as midwives refused to go along with it. When Pharaoh asked why the boys were still alive, they lied to him to cover up their actions. Instead of punishing them, God actually blessed these women for protecting the babies. So it's not always wrong. For example, if you're hiding someone in your house to protect them from someone, it's not wrong to lie. Like when people hid Jews in their houses in Nazi Germany, that was fine. So that's one thing to do. Another thing is we need to raise public awareness. Expose and speak out publicly against it to shift public perception, or at least warn people of what's coming. At this phase, your job is to slow the extremists down, protect people, and make sure the truth survives, not to fight them with violence. You want to expose and resist the evil through truth, advocacy, and strategic action. If authorities and the media are compromised or deceived, the usual channels for exposure may fail. So you may have to resort to the following methods: educating small, trusted networks who can see the truth, strengthening moral and civic resilience in communities so the evil group's influence is resisted locally. And then public exposure may not work immediately, but the goal is to ensure that the truth survives and is available when it can make a difference. So basically, at this phase of their plot to take over, you need to fight them with non-violent means. And when or if they actually take over, that's when it's morally justified to fight. You also need to act proportionally to the threat and the harm you can prevent. So phase one can sometimes stop them, but under certain conditions. The key is to understanding that phase one is about prevention, exposure, and preparation. If done strategically, it can derail or neutralize a plot before it gains enough power to act. Early action focuses on prevention and exposure, not confrontation. Confrontation becomes morally defensible when the harm is real, imminent, and unstoppable by non-violent means. So phase two is when the extremists take power and begin enforcing evil laws. The threat becomes imminent and actual, with innocent people directly harmed. Morally, more direct resistance can be justified, including defensive force, civil disobedience, or rebellion, depending on the situation. The principle of proportionality still applies. Civil disobedience and strategic law-breaking should be done when necessary. Illegal acts can be morally right if they prevent greater harm. So, protecting lives from immediate danger can morally justify acts that would otherwise be illegal. History shows that there are times when laws are unjust or authorities are corrupt, and acting according to conscience can be the morally right path, even if it's still illegal. What is the moral thing to do? For example, in the early days of Nazi Germany, there were people who saw through the Nazi regime and rebelled. That was illegal, but they did the right thing. They stood up to evil. They didn't have the option of not taking the law into their own hands because the law and the authorities enforcing their law were tyrannical and opposing anyone who undermined them. The widely respected German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who lived in Nazi Germany during World War II, is a powerful example of this because he shows that sometimes Christians may be faced with terrible choices when evil regimes rise. He became one of the most courageous voices of resistance against Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. In the early years, his opposition took non-violent forms. He preached boldly, condemned Nazi policies, helped organize safe networks for Jews, and used his connections to support those fleeing Germany. But as the atrocities mounted, Bonhoeffer became increasingly entangled in the German resistance. By the 1940s, certain military leaders and civilians were secretly plotting to remove Hitler from power, even through assassination. Bonhoeffer, though not the architect of these plans, became connected to the conspirators through his family ties and his work with underground networks. His role was never that of a soldier or assassin. Instead, he operated more in the shadows, communicating with Allied forces, passing intelligence, and giving moral and theological support to those planning Hitler's removal. This involvement was not without great inner struggle. As a Christian, Bonhoeffer believed in the commandment not to kill. Yet he also saw the monstrous evil of the Nazi regime and the countless lives being slaughtered under Hitler's rule. In his work, Ethics, he wrestled with the idea that in extreme situations, true responsibility before God might mean choosing the lesser of two evils. To stand by and do nothing, knowing millions were being murdered, was in his eyes a greater sin than joining a plot that might require bloodshed to stop genocide. In 1943, the Gestapo arrested Bonhoeffer for his resistance activities. Eventually, his connection to the conspiracy against Hitler was uncovered. He was imprisoned, transferred to concentration camps, and finally executed by hanging in Flossenburg in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. Bonhoeffer's legacy endures because he combined deep faith with costly action, showing that resisting evil sometimes requires incredible moral courage. Today, he is remembered by many Christians as a man who counted the cost and stood firm for righteousness in one of history's darkest hours. Some people will say that not fighting back violently until phase 2 when they carry out their plot will be too late because they won't carry out their plot until they outnumber us, and that's when it will be too late. The problem with a preemptive strike is that acting too early or recklessly can backfire and do more damage than good, making things worse. It can make you appear as an aggressor, creating martyrs and giving the extremist group propaganda power. Innocent people can be harmed. You could actually be harming innocent people. It can trigger escalation before the threat is fully clear. Even morally justified action must weigh probability of success versus risk of harm. So phase 1, prior to their takeover, is the crucial window. It is the best chance to stop the extremist plot before it gains momentum, recruits, or resources. And if it does get to phase 2, the extremist group might actually fail because they might actually be outnumbered due to the public awareness that was created in phase 1. Non-violent measures, exposing the truth, protecting the vulnerable, building public awareness, and strengthening ethical networks are the most effective and morally defensible strategies. For example, the same principle applies if someone is plotting to take your life and you know it, but either can't prove it to the police, or you can, but they won't listen or do anything. You still can't go after the person who's plotting against you and kill them first. You have to wait for them to strike first. It's very important to separate imminent threat from potential threat. Under New Zealand law, you can use reasonable force to defend yourself if you believe someone is about to attack you. The threat must be immediate, about to happen, or in progress. If someone is planning in secret and there is no immediate action, preemptively attacking them is illegal. It counts as murder or assault. The same would be true according to biblical standards like in the Old Testament law. Merely plotting doesn't justify killing them first. Both the Old Testament legal pattern and modern legal and moral systems require immediacy. You may legally use lethal force only when the attack is imminent or actually underway, or when a legal judicial authority has lawfully condemned the person. Morally, killing someone who is merely plotting but not actively attacking is generally not justified. Acting too early would be considered assault or murder regardless of your foreknowledge. So if you know danger is coming, but the authorities won't acknowledge it, you can't go after the threat first. What you can do is you can prepare yourself and your space, setting up strong defenses so that if they come to you, you're ready to respond. You can prepare defensively. So the question is, how could we strategize now for a future scenario where an extremist group were to outnumber us and take over our society? Defending yourself is morally permissible, but preemptively harming someone who hasn't acted yet is not. Preparing defensively is morally proactive. You're protecting life and others without crossing the moral line. And this could apply on a large scale level. If you discovered there was actually a large scale extremist agenda to infiltrate Western society, outnumber us, take over the government, and then enforce evil laws, but the authorities were refusing to acknowledge the evidence, although you couldn't strike first, you could collectively strategize and prepare to fight back for when the time comes. The principle scales up from personal self-defense to societal or collective defense. The moral and legal reasoning remains largely the same. You cannot preemptively attack, but you can prepare, organize, and plan defensive strategies so that if and when the threat becomes imminent, you can respond effectively. Legally, you cannot launch attacks on individuals or groups based on suspected intentions. That would be criminal, conspiracy, assault, or terrorism. Morally, you cannot justify harming people who have not yet acted. Doing so would violate the principles of justice, proportionality, and the protection of innocence. Attempting preemptive attacks on a group based on suspicion or ideology is both illegal and morally problematic because it risks harming innocents and undermines moral legitimacy. Well-planned, non-violent, defensive strategies can significantly limit the effectiveness of the threat once it manifests. This is essentially the same logic as personal self-defense, just applied on a societal scale. You prepare, fortify, and educate, but you only act decisively when the threat is real and imminent. In Scripture, there are times when God calls his people to stand and resist evil, but there are also times when he makes clear that resisting would actually mean opposing his own judgment. Obedience to human authorities may sometimes include submission, especially if those authorities are instruments of God's judgment. For example, when Babylon came against the nation of Judah, the prophet Jeremiah told the people that this invasion was not simply a political correct, but God's hand of judgment. They were commanded not to fight back, but to submit to Babylon, because to resist was to fight against God himself. It should also be noted that Babylon was quite morally and politically corrupt by any standard, even in the context of the ancient world. Babylon was a dominant military power, famous for siege warfare, deportations, and brutal treatment of conquered peoples. Christians cannot simply adopt one blanket rule for every situation. If God is actively using an oppressive regime as judgment, then fighting back may be disobedience. But if an authority commands direct disobedience to God's law, such as worshipping false gods, murdering innocents, or renouncing Christ, then as a Christian, civil disobedience or resistance may be required. So what's our role as Christians? Well, our role is to love Muslims, even those who hold extremist beliefs, and pray for them. Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Our goal isn't to kill them, but to preach Christ to them, because only the gospel can change their hearts. Thank you for listening, and God bless.